Welcome to our show, the Hollywood Backlot with Lou and you. We are taking your questions. Lou Wasserman's ghost is here with me right now. Lou, the amount of comments and the people who are really into this show, it is just phenomenal, Lou. You got to be proud.
And we have a funny announcement to make. Suddenly, and maybe they've been doing it a long time and I didn't know, but if people out there know what IMDb is, the Internet Movie Database, they have put up profiles of lots of prominent YouTubers, including all of us, Pro and you and Jonas and everybody. But what's funny is the one for me, they mix me up with the real guy. And it shows Lou Wasserman, and it shows he died in 2018. And then it shows all of my appearances on here since then. So I am officially a real ghost now, according to the IMDb, which is hilarious. Just goes to show you, those damn bots, they'll screw you up every time.
Anyway. You can see right here. So here's the real Lou Wasserman. This is on IMDb, folks. And if we go down here to archive footage is where it's at, you can see
Park Place,
where Lou Wasserman's ghost has
Renegade,
been.
Lorena, Spice Lounge, Floral. And then I don't know what Les Chroniques du Mea and the Reagans and Black Godfather are about. But anyway, it's the world is a carousel of Lou's.
I love that.
So we were amused by that this week when we found out. Now, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the wonderful comments that you've been giving us, and I actually jumped into the comment stream on the last one to answer a few quick questions that really wouldn't fit in the whole show. Just to remind those of you who may be new, and if you are, you should go back and watch the other three, the ground rules. I will not divulge personal confidences or go too deeply into any particular program that I had anything to do with. But general questions about Hollywood, about how things really work versus how you think they work versus, as we discovered, I think last time or the time before, how some professor told you they work and whose politics are what and all that's all fair game. And we hope it provides you with some insight into the wonderful world of this crazy business called show.
That is absolutely true right there. If you want to go ahead and send us your questions, you can go ahead and do so right down below at the link provided there, T3P online @yahoo.com right there. Or you can put them in the comments. But folks, I mean, maybe you get your question asked, maybe you don't. And like Jonas alluded to on that Park Place live stream that we just had preceding this show, might be exclusive to members in the future. So get your questions in now while you still can. We left off the last show, Lou, talking about Lou Wasserman, obviously, and just a profoundly interesting man that he is, and how he was really the last king of Hollywood, and it was so great. But we did tease our audience on a Lou Wasserman story. Do you have one to share with us here?
Oh, well, as I told you, MCA, the Music Corporation of America, which is really one of the biggest agencies, which Lou was the boss of, and which when they needed to find someplace to make shows, they were packaging, where they'd put together clients who were actors and directors and writers and other actors and make a whole deal for a sponsor. Because remember, just like radio, it wasn't so much the networks that picked the shows originally. It was, if you got a sponsor, you had a sponsor to pay the bills, and they were willing to take it then to the networks and obviously run their commercials. In fact, there's a funny story from radio I could tell you first. W.C. Fields had a sponsor, and I can't remember what brand it was, of cigarettes for many years for his radio show. And there came a time when they were trying to kind of hold him up financially. And so one week he went on his show, and it was not this brand, but he said, I'd like to put a special message out to my dear nephew, Chester, because Chester is the greatest kid. And I got to tell you, I'm so proud of him. So folks, give a hand to Chester Fields. And that was a message to, I think it was Paul Mall or Winston, saying, if you don't like me, I'll go to Chester Fields and they'll sponsor me. Because as those of you old enough to remember know, Chester Fields was a brand of cigarettes. So this rivalry with sponsors and what have you was a real deal. Well, basically, Lou worked it out so that after a few years, Universal, the studio that they owned, had a lock with NBC. Almost everything NBC had on the air came from Universal. And that was technically against the rules of both the FCC and the various talent unions, because they didn't want monopolies again. But the person who would enforce that was something out of the office of the president then, which was LBJ. And as we showed you, and you found a picture of him on the plane coming back from the assassination of JFK, this guy named Jack Valenti, who was LBJ's aide, was looking to get out of politics and into showbiz. And Lou got him made the head of the Motion Picture Association. And suddenly the MPAA said, well, we'll give it a pass as far as NBC and Universal. So that's the kind of deal maker that he was. He was also the first agent in town to get a star a percentage of the movie as part of their compensation. And that was for his client, Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart was his client. And Ronald Reagan was his client. And a lot of big people, he was their agent. So he was a very interesting guy. And if you want to, you also put up, I know last time in the pictures, and probably can do again, a very good book that tells the details, in some cases to a level of detail that you probably won't care about. It's not the most scintillatingly written book I've ever read as far as biographies are concerned of showbiz people, but it's interesting. And if you're really desperate for entertainment about all of the wiles and wherefores of Lou, there it is. I am not him. You asked last time if I worked for him. Technically, I guess I did, because I did shows at Universal when he was the boss, but I'd see him in the commissary once in a while, but that's as close as I ever came to having any personal contact with him.
Wow.
Although now spiritually, we get out our Ouija boards and talk to each other before I do this show every week. Or at least IMDb thinks so.
Right. I was just about to say IMDb, they never lie right there.
But meanwhile, back at the Backlot, what do you got for me?
We have a bunch of stuff back at the Backlot here. So many people were offering their questions, and it's really, really great to see that contact right there. Very, very cool. First question comes from Four Little Birds 6166. I've always been told that Hollywood started in Jacksonville, Florida, and that they were run out of town due to flagrant sinful lifestyles.
I know nothing about this at all. I have never in all my years heard anything about Jacksonville, Florida. And of course, if it had, quote unquote, started there, it wouldn't be called Hollywood. It would be called Jacksonville. That reminds me of that line from the original China movie at Epcot about Marco Polo visiting, I forget the name of which city in China that has canals, and saying that Marco Polo called it the Venice of the East. And he said, I guess if I'd gone to Venice, they would call it I think it was Suzhou of the West. So anyway, Jacksonville's a great place. I can tell you everywhere that's good to eat there because, I happen to visit there fairly often, about once or twice a year for reasons we won't go into. But nice place, but they might have made some movies there. But as far as the sinful lifestyle of Hollywood, heck, everybody hated that. As I think I mentioned last time, actors were and people in show business were very much looked down upon by the establishment in Los Angeles as much as everywhere else. And that's how Beverly Hills became kind of a star hangout, because they didn't care as long as you had the money and come here and enjoy yourself. And that's where all of the great stars of the early years lived and made themselves a home.
And now there is a Hollywood, Florida, though, that is kind of strange.
The name floats around. I think, it's like there's another one, I think, in New Mexico or a few other places. As I mentioned last time, the original Hollywood, that the Hollywood we all know and sometimes are able to love, was named after, was a town in Massachusetts, I believe, that a couple who came out to the LA area and found this one little region and built themselves a lovely home and a hotel, and then started subdividing the rest of the land and called it Hollywood. But, what's in a name? Podunk would smell as sweet if you could make $50 million at the box office. So maybe not.
Well, a fantastic answer here, Lou, because I hadn't heard that
when
before.
I saw that one come in, I thought, Jacksonville, my God, why there? So,
why Jacksonville?
But, Florida was the Wild West in a different kind of way, until Disney, except for Miami.
Now, you did answer this on YouTube a little bit there, but I kind of wanted you to bring it forward into the show because, not everybody reads the comments, and I think you had some really interesting thoughts on this right here. This is from Trooper Donnie right here. Do you think Lou ever worked with Lucille Ball?
I'm sure they knew each other, but they were not the same studio in any way, shape, or form. So, worked with, no. although Lucy became a kind of a mini mogul. Many of you may not be aware that Desilu, which was Lucy and Desi's production company, which had their own studio, they produced and started in the same year against the odds with resistance from the networks and ratings that weren't the greatest to begin with, two little teeny weeny shows that went on to a certain amount of success called Star Trek and Mission Impossible. So without them, those may not have ever occurred. So they had a lot of influence. And of course, Desi invented the whole process of what's called multi-camera sitcom shooting on film. And then later, now, of course, it's digital. But until then, a lot of times you'll see a show. For example, we were talking about that video of opening day at Disneyland, and that they've cleaned up the film a little. And that was what's called a kinescope. And a lot of people are confused what a kinescope is. Remember last time we were talking about frame rates and 24 versus 30 versus whatever.
Right.
There was no way, because videotape had not been invented, there was no way to actually record the straight video signal, which in those days would have been black and white, of course, coming off the camera switcher. When I say switcher, there is a panel that all of the cameras that are being used, whether it's 2, 3, 12, whatever, feed into. And a guy sits there and the director says, cut to 1, cut to 2, cut to 3. And he's pushing these buttons on this switcher or working a fader bar or other effects to come up with the output, which is then going, in most cases, live on the air and is not being recorded. Now, they invented a way to record it and figured out that frame rate differential so it wouldn't have this flicker to it, called a kinescope. And what it was a 16 millimeter film camera aimed at a special monitor so that while the program was being beamed out, it could be recorded on film. Not well, not pretty, not perfect, but better than nothing. Well, that was the only recording there was because there were no reruns. There was no reason for reruns, and nobody envisioned a reason for them. So it was a instant medium that went out and never was heard again. Now, people wonder, well, then how come there's all these recordings of the old radio shows? Well, the reason for that was the time differences across America. Way back when, my mom, who was an actress on radio, started out in the business screaming. It was a horror anthology radio show. And at the very beginning, in the opening credits, they had a church gong and a woman screaming. That was my mother when she was in high school. And for $25 a week in high school in the early 40s, I guess it would have been, or late 30s, she'd go to the studio and they'd do the show once for the East Coast. And they'd all go out and have dinner and come back and do it again for the West Coast because there was no taping. But in those days, on a lot of shows, they kept what they called transcription records, which are these giant vinyl records, because in order to get a whole show of an hour or so or half an hour on, in those days, you had to, the spacing of the grooves, if you know what a real phonograph record looks like, I know a lot of you are too young to even remember them, were further apart and the machine was slower, but they're these big, they're about, I don't know, I think at least 16, 18 inches in diameter, transcription recording. So radio, they recorded because maybe they didn't want to do it twice. They wanted to do it once and preserve it. And also for a more complicated production, doing it live as far as sound effects and music and an orchestra and everything else was difficult. But television wasn't that way. It was live and that was it. Until this guy, Desi Arnaz, said, hey, guys, I got an idea. How about if I pay for it? If I pay the cost, can I do the show on film, cut it, give you the film to broadcast, and can I keep the ownership of the film? They said, sure, what good is it? That's how Desi made millions and started a whole industry of multi-camera film shows that could be cut later, like a movie with 4 optional views, or 3 in those days, and later they added a 4th one.
Wow.
And I could go on about multi-camera sitcoms all day because I've been involved in quite a few of them.
That's for sure. That's why I wanted to include that footage, or the photographs in the last show of kind of their setup on Disneyland, because
and remember, when it's not an independent film camera, when it's a video camera going to that switching spot before it gets broadcast, you got to have a long cable and nobody's stepping on it between you and that spot. So there's a lot of jobs for guys who literally just chase around and hold onto the cables and make sure they don't get tangled and all that sort of thing.
Now, the kinescope, if I'm not mistaken, the moon landing was the the only recordings that we have of it were the recordings of that kinescope, right?
Well,
If I'm not mistaken.
it's not exactly kinescope, but yes.
Okay.
The broadcast coming back from the cameras on the Eagle was then
Right.
photographed. Exactly.
Yeah. Apparently, NASA lost the original footage or something like that,
Oh
and
yeah,
so we only
well,
have.
that's of course that's happened to a lot of the classic old movies, especially the silents, but the early sound pictures are gone forever because in those days the original film stock that they were shot on, that the negatives were on and that the positives were on, was made out of something called nitrate, which was a plastic material. Nitrate, you might think about it for a minute and say, well, that sounds like other things, other words. And you know from science classes in school that something that says ox in it somewhere has oxygen, or, well, it turns out the other thing you can do with nitrate is make nitroglycerin out of it. And in World War I, when we needed munitions to fight the war, all of these great films, they said, oh, who cares? Who needs them? There was no sense of history. And they were recycled into bombs and artillery shells. So a lot of them went away. And then the other thing about nitrate film is, as it might sound, it's highly flammable. And that is why if you go back to very old movie theaters, all these great Art Deco movie palaces, that projection booth is built like a blockhouse. I mean, the walls are 1.5 or 2 feet thick, and it's got all of these metal shields that drop down over the windows where the image flies out to the screen. Because if, God forbid, it ever caught fire and blew up, they don't want to kill the whole audience with that explosion or that fire. That's why on the back lot of all the old studios, you will find the film vaults over in one corner of the lot. And again, they're very similar in appearance to if you've ever been to a national armory or a place where munitions are stored. So a lot of it just dissolved. It turns out after time, nitrate film basically just disintegrates into powder. So a lot of these things where you see that a film has been restored, that's serious scientific and in some cases dangerous work. And they can maybe find a bunch of existing prints. And this one, this scene's good. And this one, that scene's pretty good. And now, of course, with all the image stuff you can do in a computer, they can pump it all through there and come up with a new master of it.
Fascinating stuff. It's fascinating how
This is why, the Academy Awards, the Academy is called the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, because there's a heck of a lot of science involved in making a movie, whether it's what I've just been talking about, or whether it's lighting, or whether it's sound, or they used to they still do special Oscars for somebody who comes up with a new and better gizmo to do something. So there's a whole scientific side to this business.
Fascinating.
Sometimes which seems totally all that intellectual activity wasted when you see some of the stuff they make with it. But anyway.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Lou, for providing some insight into that. What was, I was thinking more a benign question. You really turned it into something quite fascinating. And I'm sure I'm going to have images in here that will give a lot of texture to what you're saying. Absolutely phenomenal. Thank you. Let's see here. Let's go to our next question right here. This is from. Okay, if I butchered the name, I do apologize. Saku Naruful. I believe it is. Could you give an overview for the evolution of marketing for movie musicals between then and now?
Well, of course, we don't do many now, and they're nothing like the classic musicals of old. The marketing was pretty straightforward, and it really followed the marketing traditions of Broadway because that's where the musicals originally came from. I mean, you have to remember that in the history of the theater, until Oklahoma, which you can look it up and see what year it is and find the photos, Oklahoma was the first musical that was actually a complete story from start to finish that had songs. Before that, they were all reviews where they were different musical numbers on different themes maybe, but they weren't a coherent storyline with characters the way a play was. And of course, most of those shows came from the theater to the movies. And then you had this tradition that started, really with the first sound picture, because the very first talking picture for a feature film was a thing called The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson, about a guy whose father was a cantor in the temple, but he wanted to sing jazz. And his father, you talked about the scandalous people in Jacksonville and whatever. imagine an old traditional family having a son who wanted to be a jazz musician, which was equated with sex and sin. But anyway, Al Jolson, with that movie opened and the beginning of it, he looks at the audience and says, "You folks, you ain't heard nothing yet," and starts singing, and audiences were just amazed and aghast. But even then, the musical numbers were the numbers he sang on the stage, or the religious music, particularly a thing called the Kol Nidre, that he sings as part of the temple service. So it wasn't in the classic definitions and the people who teach theory of musicals. The reason why people are singing is the emotional moment is so intense they can't just say it; they got to sing it. So that's where the music goes in a musical. Well, a lot of the original film musicals were more that review style. I mean, there were movies with titles like Broadway Melody of 1930 something. In other words, it wasn't so much a story. And if it was a story, it was a story about a singer who wanted to be a star. In other words, it was all set within the milieu of the theater. In fact, if you would like to see a hilariously brilliant movie, and any of you are fans of the TV show MASH and the movie, the guy that wrote MASH, Larry Gelbart, also had a movie called Movie. And what it really is a satire of two different classic styles of movies, about half and half in the one film, like a double feature of old, with even trailers for non-existent spoof movies in the middle between the two, just like they would have been in an old-time Saturday matinee. Well, the first movie is a classic story of the young kid who wants to be a boxer because he needs money for his sister's eye operation. And it's pretty funny. There's a scene where he says, he's talking to his father about the problem of paying for the doctors. And he says, "You know what they get for an eye? An arm and a leg," because Gelbart was a riot. Well, in the other movie, it's a musical, and it features George C. Scott in a very wonderful comedic role, playing a kind of entrepreneurial theater director named Spats Baxter. And it's the young girl who wants to be a star, and she's the understudy. And it's got the classic line that, "Kid, you're just going out there a talented amateur, but you're coming back a star," And he actually is dying at the end of the movie, and she's holding him and saying, "Oh, come on, Spats, you can't die." And he looks up at her, and Larry Gelbart's so funny. He says, I'll never forget this line. He says, "Kid, that's the way it is in this show business. One day you're waiting in the wings, and the next day you're wearing them." So it's a hilariously fun movie. You should get sometime. Again, called Movie. But again, all of these, the Busby Berkeley movies, which Lullaby of Broadway, 42nd Street, with Ruby Keeler, famously, who was a dancer and a singer, and Jimmy Cagney, and all kinds of great stars, that had these scenes where it theoretically was happening on a stage in New York. But then the camera pulls back, and we're in a set that's 10 times bigger than any stage. And those are the movies you may have seen, or you may even remember there was a bit of it in the Great Movie Ride at Disney World, of all of those geometric formations of thousands of what looked like thousands of girls all leaning and swinging and kicking their legs. And of course, my favorite ones, there's a number, you can look it up online and see it on YouTube, I'm sure, of Carmen Miranda, who was this famous South American singer who always wore this headdress full of tropical fruit. And she has this song called "The Lady in the Tutti Frutti Hat" that is pretty damn wonderful. But anyway, musicals went on from there to all the great MGM stuff in the late 40s and the 50s with people like Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds and Ann Miller and Sid Charisse. And, well, they were wonderful, marvelous romances. By the way, Fred Astaire, who started on the stage, you all, I hope, have seen Fred Astaire, maybe the greatest dancing man in the history of dancing men. But when they did his screen test, because somebody saw him somewhere on the stage, he had an act with his sister, Adele, and thought, gee, he'd be good in the movie. So they called the studio, and the studio used to send out, what they called talent scouts to go evaluate somebody and see if they seemed to have enough promise to bring him back to Hollywood and take some test film of him and hire him on a contract. And supposedly the official assessment of Fred Astaire, his first one, was no looks, no hair, can't act, can't sing, dances a little. that's how so they didn't always get their judgments right, but luckily somebody superseded that, and we had Fred Astaire, and of course Gene Kelly. So when you talk about the marketing, though, the marketing was times are tough, whether it's the Depression or World War II. Come have a good night out and take your, tap, tap, tap your troubles away with all the tap dancing and singing and carrying on. So they were not, movies about deep subjects, but they were and still are great, great fun. And then they started making movies about the movie business that were musicals, the most famous of which is Singing in the Rain, which all takes place at a movie studio with Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor and Debbie Reynolds. And you all have seen, of course, the famous scene of actually Singing in the Rain, where he did that whole dance number on that stage with all the water flowing. There were also, speaking of water musicals, there was Esther Williams, who was a champion swimmer, and they had a whole giant soundstage at MGM that the floor came out, and there was a huge swimming pool in the bottom of that stage. They also used it for Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan in some of those swimming scenes. But and they did all of those formations underwater where they'd come up out of the water with sparklers in her hair. And later days, of course, we had synchronized swimming in the Olympics, but it really all started with those musicals. And they were always, they had serious romances, but they were comedic romances. And there was always, the second lead was the funny guy, whether it was Donald O'Connor or Red Skelton did a lot of them. So nowadays, musicals, they kind of reverted back to that review thing in the sense of when you think of stuff like, I don't know, Purple Rain and a lot of other shows where it was basically, well, it's time to throw in a song. Let's throw in a song and hope we get a record that makes a hit, or hope we get an Oscar nomination with a hit. And in fact, most of the musicals in the modern era are Disney cartoons. If you think of The Lion King and Pocahontas and everything, so those are classic musicals, really, in their style and in the way they present the story through song. I hope that answers your question. But marketing-wise, there's nothing so specifically different about how you market a musical. And as far as then and now, I would say that the actual style of the movies have changed much more than anything about how they're marketed.
This is a very good point. And I would even include, you bring up Disney musicals, and I think that's such a. I didn't expect you to go that direction, but I think it's absolutely perfect because you think about, movies like Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast, where they actually got Broadway talent.
Sure.
Those.
Sure.
And so the intersection there is really, really cool, really, really fascinating. I think the last real live action musical was probably La La Land, I think.
Yeah.
Really,
I didn't like it, but that's just me.
Well, apparently the Academy didn't either, or at least they were not going to.
You could make arguments that why can't I think of the title? The one with the cup song in it, Pitch Perfect.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Pitch Perfect. So those are musicals.
I guess I suppose so. A cappella.
But again,
for sure.
You have to remember that the whole motivation for why do you sing a song instead of talk about it is I'm so excited, I'm so in love, I'm so depressed, I'm so something that I have to sing about it. And then, of course, there are some that are more like operas where everything is sung, like Les Miserables, and a few others where it's basically all singing, including what's called in the opera recitative, which is basically dialogue, but not a song as such, with verses and rhymes and what have you. Musicals. I never thought we'd go there, but that's fine with me.
Hey,
I wrote a musical once, actually, and it got optioned for New York, and that's as far as it went. So that was fun. That was fun.
That is very cool. Thank you so much, Lou, for answering that one. Such an amazing way right there. Didn't think we were going to get into that either, but I'm glad that we did, because I'm sure there's going to be some amazing visual imagery to go along with your always amazing stories. So very, very cool right there. Thank you so much for asking that question. We have our next question here now. TLJ Screwjob 6397 has had quite a few questions right here, and he, I think, was listening to the show and was rediscovering the Dragnet radio show starring Jack Webb, So here's this question right here. Were the actors just making quieter footsteps to make it seem like they were walking down the hallways? What about pouring rain, wind blowing, or cars starting?
It's all
TLDR.
manufactured, all those sound effects, and it became a great art form to do it because, well, think about it, especially with a radio show, you got to stand in front of the microphone to be heard. So you can't be walking down the hall because they're not going to bring in a boom man and a dolly and a mic just for you to be able to do it moving. Some guy off camera is walking on a piece of wood in the right kind of shoes with a microphone on him and stopping and starting. And for that matter, those kinds of effects in a regular movie are often dubbed in later anyway. And especially going back to musicals, tap dancing. Because all musicals, pretty much all musicals, the music is recorded first, then it is played back on the stage and the actors lip sync to that recording. And then they finish cutting it and the actors, the dancers come in and dance again to the music on a piece of wood that makes it sound better and more realistic. And all those taps are put in later, and they're literally synchronizing their feet to their original foot movements the same way that they did with their voices. It's complicated to do a musical. And the reason for recording that music all in one piece is because if you want to cut during a number, the synchronization is never going to match up quite right. So you have one intact, complete soundtrack of a number without the dancing. You have play that back and shoot it from however many different angles you want to cut, all spliced together in a way that they sync up. And then you go back and you record the taps, the footfalls. So there's a lot that goes into one number. That doesn't count choreography and rehearsal and everything that goes into preparing for it. So, but as far as Dragnet and all the great radio shows, yeah, there were these sound effects guys, and they had all kinds of interesting tools. You can find probably, I'm sure, YouTube somebody showing all that stuff. They had these kind of like small barrels made out of corrugated metal with a brush against it that they could turn with a crank, like you would crank an old-fashioned washing machine, that sounded like rain or wind or other weather effects of that sort. They had gongs, they had everything, all kinds of crazy sound effects things. To give you an idea, I was one time on the set of a show where there was a big fight scene that was kind of a joke take on the classic Chopsaki Bruce Lee kind of movies. They actually had a guy there, although they didn't need this, they could have put it in later, but it was a show with an audience. They had a guy sitting there with an electronic keyboard where the keys were set not to create musical notes, but to create slaps and punches and all of those, sound effects that happen in those movies. And he was doing it live in sync with the punches being thrown by the stuntmen on the set. So you do what works. You do what works.
And there's a mixture of both musical instruments of the time, of the era, or used in very interesting ways, and like household objects turned into things that have a nice resonance that could stand in for those things, like a sheet of metal, for example.
The classic, famously strange one that worked. I don't know how familiar any of you are with the famous Orson Welles radio show of the War of the Worlds, where they put on this show as if it was a real event happening, and they thought everybody would get it. It caused riots. It caused panic. People thought the Martians were really landing on Earth in New Jersey. Well, supposedly the Martians were in these, what they called cylinders, these big evil spaceships. So for the sound effect of the door to the cylinder actually unscrewing, because it was like a screw, they went to the all-tile bathroom at the radio studio and took a mic in there on a long cable, and they took a jar of mayonnaise. And in that very echoey bathroom with all these tiles, they slowly scrape, unscrewed the jar of mayonnaise for the sound of the Martian spaceship opening. So, in fact, I think there's a movie or a TV movie of the making of that show that shows that effect and how they did it. But people were very innovative and creative and came up with ways. And then, of course, later on, all of this stuff got recorded, and literally when you finished your scene in your Western where they were shooting at each other, there was a guy who was kind of an assistant editor who put in all the gunshots, who had a bunch of them all pre-recorded and literally snipped them out and stuck them into the film at the right point so they'd sync up with the gun going off. Or the horses' footfalls. You've maybe all seen the Monty Python Holy Grail movie where they're making that joke of using coconut shells to be the horses because they haven't got horses. That's real. Not that movie, but they used to use clippity-cloppity coconut shells to imitate the sound of horses' hooves. And then the guy doing it would go or whatever to make the sound of the horse breathing or neighing or whatever. I think, was it on this show or another show? But I mentioned recently, I knew a guy in Hollywood whose entire job was crying like a baby. So that when in the scene, the principal actors would go over to, you couldn't see inside it, it was just facing them, the stroller or bassinet, and lean over and, oh, coochie, coochie, cute kid. And you heard, oh, the baby crying. That was a grown man who knew how to he put his fingers in his mouth. He was fascinating to watch him. Why didn't they get a real baby? Because you can't have a real baby on a set for long enough, because there's all kinds of child labor laws about how many hours. In fact, a lot of times when you see very young children on a TV show or a movie, they're twins, because they can only individually work for 3 or 4 hours a day, and it's an 8 or 10 hour shooting day. And if it's all scenes with the kid in it, you'd like to be able to have somebody there the whole time. And of course, they have to have teachers on the set and time off to do their schoolwork and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and the use of sound effects in film, I know it changes pretty good as recording equipment gets smaller and smaller and becomes portable.
Yeah, sure.
So like
sure. Because the original
1970s
movies, as I think I mentioned also on one of these, there was a sound department in the middle of the lot, and all of these cables went back to there, and that's where these massive film recording things would roll. Then came this wonderful, marvelous, and I know you could find a picture of this to put in, a little Swiss silvery recording device called the Nagra, Nagra, that pretty much every movie and TV show you've ever seen was recorded on. That's how universal it was. And we talked last time or the time before about the clapper sticks to make the sync mark. Well, once they got the Nagra, they could do away with, they still used the sticks to label the scene and to show where it starts, but there was what's called a sync tone, an electronic tone that the cameras and the recorder were tied together with, so that they could know that, and that was better because let's say the camera is running a little fast or a little slow. These motors are very good, but sometimes they get off. By manipulating that tone, as far as how many megahertz or whatever it was giving off, you could bring them together anyway, because that it acted as a sync pulse that everything could key off of.
That's really interesting. I did not know that, but it makes total sense, especially if you know that world right there. And
it's knowing about crystals and what speeds they vibrate at and what sounds they make, and that's how they figured out. And I'm sure the guy that invented that got one of those Technical Academy Awards. So there you go. I know the Nagra recorder did, the people who made that. And it's very portable, and it's very small, and it's very easy to use, and it's a neat toy. It's about the most expensive little tape recorder you've ever seen in your life. And of course, now, what's tape? It's all digital. It's all going on a hard drive someplace.
Which has its benefits, obviously, especially for the people producing these works right here. But there is a quality that is lost for sure.
I was going to say the quality is more about the microphones than anything else, really. They've gotten so much better. I'm always envious of our pal Valiant Renegade, because he's a real audio geek, and he's got the best sound setup of anybody I've seen on YouTube, as far as just the resonance and beauty of his voice when he does his show.
Oh, so good. He's got a great voice, but man, that compression, it sounds very, very good. Speaking of that, by the way, I want to go ahead and share you this. I saw this on YouTube here about old school editing, and it actually goes into a little bit of what you were talking about, especially with that machine there.
There's an editing room, and there's what's called a multi-gang, because it has more than one piece of film going through it, moviola. And that's I've done it myself, as they say. And
this process is so fascinating to me. You can see the sync there. And you can
that
see
was
the
the thing
clapper
that you
sticks.
showed last time, a synchronizer where you put the sound and the picture together. They came up with the moviola is a mechanical device that does all this, that you can watch the film and put several pieces in and cut it. For that multi-camera film sitcom stuff, guy named can't think of his last name, but the guy who was the producer of, if you remember Barney Miller, the TV show with Hal Linden and Abe Vigoda as cops, they had this famous 4-screen moviola. It looked like an octopus and they could put the whole show in there, because all the scene is running side by side, and say cut from here to here, from here to here, the same way I said they did with buttons on on video. But boy, I've spent a lot of time sitting at moviolas. And then later they came up with these things called an editing table that were a little bit more sophisticated than moviola.
Fascinating stuff. I could go on about sound and the synchronization techniques and all kinds of stuff for forever, but I think our audience might get bored, so we'll have to circle back around to that for sure. This is our final question right here. This comes from Packing Protons, which has been so supportive of the show right here. I didn't quite know what he was referring to.
I saw this question and I have absolutely no idea what he's talking about. Did I say something that sounded like Clunk on one of the other shows? And I know Colonel Clink, but cat named Clunk, I have no idea. Young Punk, I know, but I saw this and I said, what? I like Packing Protons. I'd like to answer his question if I understood it, but I'm sorry, I don't. So maybe we need one more rather than ending on that.
Okay. Well, I can end this here now. Lou, we talked about this quite extensively in the live show right here, but I just kind of wanted to ask a clarifying question. So I'll go ahead and bring mine up. Interesting enough right now, the rock hit piece recently mentioned above the line and how the production couldn't be half the budget. What does above the line mean?
The line is what separates the quote unquote creative performers, the writer, the director, and the actors, from the grips, the electricians, the cameraman, whatever. That's the line. And that is not the reason, but how you know that you have the Screen Actors Guild and the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild, but you have the grips union. Theoretically, a guild is a little more hoity-toity thing, but that isn't always practically true. And that's what the line is. So when you hear people talk about the above the line and below the line, in the case of a budget on a movie, you're talking about the people that make big performance salaries and maybe percentages versus the people that work, on an hourly or a weekly or a per episode basis, in the same way that people in regular jobs in the real world do, as far as how they're paid and how their benefits are calculated and all the rest of that.
I see. Well, I think that just about does it right here. I want to leave people on a teaser of some kind right there. I don't know, maybe, Lou, do you know anything about film financing and how that all works behind the scenes?
Yes, of course.
Oh, okay, because that's something of particular interest, I know, for me and many of our viewers of our other networks. So,
well, I heard a line about the wine business that applies to the movie business too, and they said, how do you make a small fortune in the wine business? And the answer was start with a large fortune. So same thing can be true in the movies, but we can go into more details about how financing works and has worked in the past and does work now. And we'll do all of that next time. Why not?
I love it. I love that. Okay.
Well, everybody loves to talk about money, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, it is show business, but it is a business, right? So we definitely have to,
business I know, as the song lyric goes.
That's true. For more of your questions to be answered here, folks, make sure you go ahead and use that email address right down below at t3ponline@yahoo.com to make sure that your questions are asked. And you can leave the comments, but hey, you know what? For a limited time only, that is for sure. So make sure you deliver us your questions right here for Lou to answer. Lou, thank you so much for joining me on this episode right here. Thank you for providing such amazing answers to our comments right here. People love you. I absolutely adore you. They can listen to you for hours, and I know I can as well.
Well, I'm glad I can't talk for hours because I would start repeating myself, and I'm probably already doing that. But, as I've said, I happen to have been sort of at the right place at the right time a lot of times in my life, and I paid attention. It's amazing how many people go through the biz oblivious to very, very, what to me is very basic stuff. So if I can illuminate the darker corners and demystify some of the mysteries, I'm happy to do it. And I hope people are having as much fun as it seems they are.
I think they are. Well, that just about does it here for Hollywood Backlot with Lou and you. Thank you for joining us, folks. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Please comment, like, and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place for all the news that should be fun.